where I want to be in 6 years. And that's the way I approached it. I didn't approach it by looking, well, this is where I want to be in 12 years. You can't say, well, in 12 years I want to be here, because you have to deal with each thing at hand. I was asked a question not too long ago that stayed with me for a while. Somebody said, Walter, who are the 5 people in football you love the most? I laughed. I said, you sure you only want 5? Because football gave me a lot of people. Some I played with for years. Some I only knew for a little while. Some were already famous before anybody outside Mississippi knew who Walter Payton was. And there were a few who probably got on my nerves as much as I got on theirs. That's just how it is. You spend enough time around the same people, you're going to have good days and bad days. People remember the games. I understand that. They remember the touchdowns and the big runs and that Bears team everybody still wants to talk about. I remember those things too. But I also remember sitting around after practice when nobody was in a hurry to leave. I remember guys telling the same stupid stories we'd already heard 100 times. I remember bus rides where everybody was tired and nobody said much. And I remember looking across a locker room and seeing people I'd spent more time with than some members of my own family. You don't think about that when you're young. You're just playing football. Then the years go by and somebody asks you a question like this. Suddenly you start seeing those faces again. So I thought about it for a while. There were plenty of names I could have chosen, but these 5 kept coming back to me. Not because they had the most records. Not because somebody told me they belonged on a list. I just liked these people. I respected them. And when I think about my years in football, I'm glad our lives crossed when they did. The first name that came to me was Jim Brown. Now, Jim and I never played together. By the time I got to the NFL, he had already been out of the game for quite a while. But I knew Jim Brown. Every young running back knew Jim Brown. I remember watching him when I was younger and thinking, man, that guy doesn't run like he's afraid of anybody. That stayed with me. Jim would get the ball, see a defender coming, and sometimes it looked like he was just as interested in hitting that defender as the defender was in hitting him. I liked that. I really did. Because I never believed a running back had to be the guy taking all the punishment. Sometimes you ought to give a little back. People compared me to Jim later on, and I never knew what to do with that. Jim was Jim. I was me. We didn't even run the same way. But I understood why people brought his name up. He had become the standard. If you were a running back and you were doing something good, sooner or later somebody was going to mention Jim Brown. I never took that as an insult. How could you? There were times later when I'd be around Jim and I'd almost forget that this was the same man I'd watched when I was younger. That's one of the funny things about football. The people you grow up watching eventually become people you can sit down and talk with. And Jim was somebody I enjoyed talking to. He had opinions about everything. Believe me, everything. We didn't always see things exactly the same way either. That was all right. I never needed Jim Brown to agree with me. I was just happy that the kid who once watched him run the football eventually got the chance to know the man a little bit. That meant something to me. Another man I always had a lot of respect for was Gale Sayers. Gale was different for me because when I came to Chicago, his name was already everywhere. People would talk about him like he had just played the Sunday before, and I understood it. I'd seen Gale run. Everybody had. He could make a man miss without looking like he was trying very hard. 1 second a defender had him lined up and the next second Gale was somewhere else. I couldn't run like that. I don't think many people could. When I got to the Bears, naturally people wanted to compare us. That's what people do. New running back comes to Chicago and somebody asks, is he the next Gale Sayers? I never liked that question much. Not because it bothered me being mentioned with Gale. That part was an honor. I just didn't want to be the next anybody. And Gale never made me feel like I had to be. That's something I appreciated about him. He could have looked at some young kid coming into Chicago and thought, this is still my town. Those people are still talking about me. But that wasn't how I remember Gale. He was quiet. He carried himself well. And when he said something to you, you listened because he wasn't the kind of guy who spent all day talking just to hear himself talk. I liked being around people like that. Years later, people would still ask me who was better, Gale or me. I'd usually smile. What was I supposed to say? Gale had his way. I had mine. That's the nice thing about football. There can be room for both. But I'll tell you something. When you're a young running back wearing a Chicago Bears uniform and Gale Sayers treats you with respect, you remember it. I certainly did. Then there was Jim McMahon. Jim made me laugh. I think that's probably the first thing I remember about him. You never quite knew what that guy was going to do. He'd come walking into the locker room with those sunglasses on, sometimes wearing something that made you wonder whether he knew we had a football game that day. That was Jim. He didn't care much about looking like everybody else. And on our team that was saying something, we had enough characters in that locker room already. Jim just added another one. I remember there were days when practice wasn't going particularly well. Coach Ditka was mad about something. Somebody had missed an assignment. Everybody was getting a little tight. Then Jim would say something. Sometimes it wasn't even that funny. But coming from him at that particular moment, it was enough. Guys would start laughing and we'd get back to work. I enjoyed that about him. People remember all the other stuff, the headbands, the sunglasses, the things he said to reporters. I remember sitting next to the guy. I remember being in the huddle with him, and I remember how tough he was. Jim took some shots. There were times I'd watch him get hit and think, boy, he's going to feel that one tomorrow. Then he'd get up, maybe complain about it a little. Actually, he'd probably complain about it a lot. But he'd get up. That's what mattered. After you've played with somebody for a few years, those are the things you remember. Not every pass, not every score. You remember what kind of guy he was when things weren't going well. Jim was somebody I wanted beside me. He could drive people crazy. He certainly drove Coach Ditka crazy a few times, probably more than a few. But I liked him. We went through some pretty special years together, and whenever I think about that old Bears locker room, it doesn't take very long before I can see Jim sitting somewhere in it, usually with those damn sunglasses on. Now, Mike Ditka, Mike could get mad at me, and I could get mad at Mike. That's probably the easiest way to explain our relationship. We were both stubborn. Mike had an idea about how something should be done, and sometimes I had another idea. Neither one of us was very good at saying, well, maybe you're right. So we had our moments. I can still picture him on that sideline when something went wrong. You didn't even have to hear what he was saying. You could look at his face from halfway across the field and know this probably wasn't the best time to walk over and start a conversation. Some of the guys would stay away from him. I probably should have done that more often, but that wasn't really my personality either. The funny thing is, people saw Mike yelling and figured that was all there was to him. It wasn't. I spent enough years around that man to know when he was angry because he wanted something better from us. He cared. Sometimes maybe a little too loudly, but he cared. And there were plenty of times away from Sunday when Mike could make you laugh. That's the Mike people didn't always get to see. When you're together that long, the coach stops being just the guy standing in front of the meeting room. You get to know his moods. You know when to joke with him. You know when not to joke with him. And believe me, learning that second one was important with Mike. We went through a lot together. Good years, frustrating years, arguments, wins, that crazy season when it seemed like the whole country wanted to talk about the Chicago Bears. Through all of it, Mike was Mike. I wouldn't tell you I enjoyed every conversation we ever had. He probably wouldn't either. But I loved the guy. I can say that, and after all those years, I think he'd know exactly what I mean. The last guy I want to talk about is Matt Suhei. Matt and I spent a lot of time together. A lot. When you line up in the same backfield with somebody year after year, eventually you stop needing to say very much. I could look at Matt in the huddle and usually know what kind of day he was having. He could probably do the same with me. And I'll tell you something about Matt. That man hit people for me. People remember me running with the football. They remember the long runs and all that stuff. I remember Matt going into a hole ahead of me and finding some linebacker who probably weighed 250 pounds. That was his job. Go hit that guy. Then we'd come back to the huddle and do it again. I used to give him a hard time sometimes. I'd tell him, Matt, you missed that guy. He'd look at me like I was crazy. Usually he'd tell me the guy I was talking about wasn't even his man. Maybe he was right. I wasn't going to admit it. That's the kind of relationship we had. We were around each other so much that football became only part of it. You knew the families. You knew when something was bothering the other guy. You knew when to talk and when it was better to leave him alone. Those things happen slowly. You don't notice it while you're playing. Then one day you look back and realize that man was standing a few feet away from you for a pretty big part of your life. That's Matt for me. There were bigger names in football. There were certainly guys who got more attention. Matt never seemed too worried about any of that. He just showed up. He did his job, and he was there for me. When I think about all those Sundays in Chicago, I can still picture him lining up in front of me. I liked seeing him there. Made me feel a little better about where I was about to run. And maybe that's the simplest way I can explain why Matt Suhei means so much to me. It's funny. When you're playing, you don't really think about any of this. At least I didn't. You're too busy. There's practice tomorrow. There's another game Sunday. Something hurts. Coach is mad about something. Somebody's making noise in the locker room when you're trying to get dressed. That's just your life. Then one day you're not doing it anymore. And that's when some of those little things start coming back. I don't sit around remembering every touchdown I scored. Half the time somebody has to remind me what game they're talking about. But I remember people. I remember conversations. I remember laughing with guys after practice when we probably should have already gone home. I remember sitting quietly after a loss when nobody really knew what to say. I remember looking around that locker room and seeing the same faces I'd been seeing every day for years. You don't realize how much you're going to miss that. Football was very good to me. It gave me opportunities I never imagined I'd have when I was a kid. But when I think about what I really got from the game, I don't think first about records. I think about the people I got to know. Some made me better. Some made me laugh. Some made me mad. A few managed to do all three. And if you gave me one afternoon to go back and sit around with those guys again, I don't think we'd spend much time talking about football. We'd probably tell the same old stories. Somebody would exaggerate. Somebody else would tell him he's lying. And I'd just sit there and enjoy it. Yeah, I think I'd like that.